I'm Dan Drake. This is Front Up on Visitor Network TV and Channel 99. Our guest today is Sarah Bois, who's the Director of Research and Education at the Linda Loring Nature Foundation. Welcome, Sarah. Glad to have you.
Thank you so much for having me, Dan.
I'd like to talk for a couple of minutes about your broader job, and then we have a very specific topic we want to talk about. Not a topic some people don't consider very nice, but we're going to talk about it anyway. But tell us a little bit, your background on Nantucket and when you came back and so forth.
Right. So currently, as you mentioned, I'm the Director of Research and Education at the Linda Loring Nature Foundation. Previous to that, I first came out to Nantucket as a resident in '98. And I worked at the Maria Mitchell Association as a summer intern, doing, kind of working in the museum, teaching classes, being a docent. And then over the years, I feel like I worked at probably multiple different conservation organizations. I was at the Nantucket Conservation Foundation for a while. I've worked with Mass Audubon. And so I left the island in 2007 to pursue my doctoral degree. So I was at the University of Connecticut for a while, studying invasive plants in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. After a short stint in Oregon, Nantucket lured me back, and I was fortunate enough to get this position at the Linda Loring Nature Foundation.
And what does the job involve, essentially? Right.
So it's kind of funny. I have this duality of my position. So I'm research and education. So I'm in a fortunate position that I can conduct research on the property at the Linda Loring Nature Foundation. So we have 86 acres of open space. So doing research on the sandplain grasslands, the coastal heathlands, so the plants, the animals, the rare flora and fauna, looking for invasives. We're doing a number of different research projects, and we can talk about those in depth. But and then the other part of my job, the education part, we both do kids programs in the summer. We do adult workshops throughout the year. But what I really love is that my job gives me the opportunity to incorporate the public into the research. So we use the term citizen science, but we do a lot with outreach, working with school groups to have them come onto the property, tell them about what we're doing, have them collect some data, see what it's like. I'm also fortunate to work with some independent projects, so students that have their own science fair project or their own independent research, and we guide them. So I love that duality of having that research, my own research, and supporting research of other scientists, but then bringing the public in to do research and be part of it, see what's going on.
And the education programs aren't intended to compete with others on the island. They're intended more to complement them and to use the property as sort of the Loring Foundation property as a living laboratory?
Yeah, I love that term, the living laboratory. So, we recognize there's lots of different conservation organizations on the island, lots of different science going on. And I think rather than competing, all of us actually work together, like Sarah Oaktai from the field station, the UMass Boston Field Station, Maria Mitchell Association, the Conservation Foundation. We all work together both through conservation, outreach, and education, and so we complement each other in different ways. And our programs, our summer programs anyway, are smaller. They're kind of one-time workshops, so people can sign up for multiple in a row, or they can have one experience. And we do a lot of work with different schools in the off season too. So we're kind of complementing each other. I think it's a great way to say it.
Why don't you also mention the storyboard, the story trail?
Oh, right. That is one of my favorite projects that happened over this winter and culminated this past May. We worked on a project with the Nantucket New School. We were fortunate to get some funding from the Nantucket Community Foundation. And we worked with the first grade and then their big friends, the seventh graders. And we call it the Stories in Nature project. So we learned about nature on Nantucket. We were inspired by the Linda Loring Nature Foundation. We did field trips. I did a lot of classroom visits. And over the course of the year, we developed our own story. So our nature story. So we learned about fact and fiction. So how do we tell something factual about nature, whether it's a plant or an animal, but then have this kind of arc of a creative story. And it was completely student driven, and I was so impressed with what they came up with.
And how is it used now that it's been done?
So now the story is complete. It's a story about some native caterpillars on the island and their trials and tribulations. And then we have each page of the story, which is illustrated by the first graders, is spread out on the trail. So we have one story, and then a couple hundred yards, there's another page of the story. And so it encourages, especially the younger ones, that they're excited that what's around the next bend, what's the next page of the story. Kind of, there's like a mini cliffhanger at each page, and they run to the next one.
Keeps them moving.
Yeah, and then the other great part of the story is it's bilingual, so we had it translated into Spanish as well, so that it kind of accesses more of our Nantucket public. And we recognize that English is by far not the only language spoken here on the island. And so it's accessible to a broader audience of our year-round population.
Let's talk about those wonderfully beautiful things called tent caterpillars.
Yes.
We've had them, we've had an infestation this year.
Yeah.
Perhaps it's seemingly more.
Yeah.
It's, they're starting to disappear now, and some of the trees they've eaten are starting to show some signs of life again. But why don't you sort of talk a little bit about what's going on there?
Yeah. So it's funny because any of the school kids who've taken my field trips or come on a field trip, and the parent chaperones will all remember my affinity for the eastern tent caterpillars. And it's not that I've on this crusade for the caterpillars. It's just that I think they have a really cool natural history story. So the eastern tent caterpillars are a native species. That's one really important thing to tell people. And they have this.
They didn't come over on a lumber truck.
They didn't come on a lumber truck. They weren't introduced to combat some other pests. They're a native species. And they have these boom and bust cycles. So there's about a 10-year decadal cycle. And when they're in a boom year, boom time, it lasts about 2 to 3 years. So this year was particularly significant or noticeable to people. And it's usually, they hatch from their eggs like mid-May, and then they start to build their tents. And so mid-May, people don't really notice them. They're about the size of half a dime, and they hang out on their eggs. So they're these little tiny black things that are just warming up in the sun. And they're a great sign of spring. They're very sensitive to temperature, so as soon as they hatch, it's like spring. And then if they're all on the same tree, all these eggs, no matter what egg mass they hatch from, they'll come together and build a tent together. So it's this little mini caterpillar commune. And that's when people start to notice that as the tents get bigger and bigger and bigger is when people really notice them. And it's a great story for children because it's saying, okay, why do you build a tent in May? Why would you have a tent in May? And it's this thinking about shelter, thinking about temperature. Because the caterpillars are so sensitive to temperature, they build these tents, and as they get bigger every day, there's multiple layers within it. And if you think about that like a little caterpillar hotel, they go up and down the floors depending on the temperature, so they can thermoregulate themselves just by moving in and out of the tent. And during the day they're going out and they're feeding on their cherry trees, which is what people don't like about them. And then at night they go back in their tents. And a lot of people know that they're on mostly cherries and some of the crab apples. Their primary host is the black cherry, so that's our native common cherry. So a native and a native, they've evolved to be dependent on each other. And so it's mostly black cherries and beach plums as well. And then they eat the leaves when the leaves are fresh and first leafing out. Now, one thing I think that is so fascinating about caterpillars are these guys is if you look at any of the tents, even the ones now that are, have been abandoned, you often can see a silk trail. So if you follow one of the branches, let's say, of the tree, there'll be this little white silk trail. And the caterpillars will follow that or make it in the first place to a certain branch, eat all the leaves on that branch, and come back down that trail.
It's how they find their way home.
It's like breadcrumbs.
Yeah, or a string.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so the next day they can follow that same trail. Now, if they've eaten all the leaves, they can just bite that little silk trail, and then they know, don't bother going there. Yeah. There's no more leaves on it.
How long is that cycle? From the time they hatch and join in a commune and then till they turn into something else?
Yeah, it's about 6 to 8 weeks. So right about now, so mid to late June, is when they leave the tents. They forage around for a little bit before they make cocoons. And so I know a couple weeks ago people were commenting on Milestone Road. There'd be like hundreds of caterpillars like going across the road. You could just see them. But it's like they're leaving the tents. They're going to eat a whole bunch more to get get up their reserves, and then they make their cocoons often in the leaf litter. So we won't necessarily see cocoons like all over the place up in the cherry trees. Their cocoons are usually in the leaf litter under things. So we found some in like the wood pile the other day. There were some little tiny cocoons.
Do they do permanent damage to those trees?
So they don't do permanent damage unless the tree or the shrub is generally already at risk. It's already diseased or old or sick. So healthy adult trees can withstand defoliation like that probably 2 or 3 times.
What is the benefit that the tree gets from the caterpillar?
Well, there's some pruning effect of the caterpillars. The other thing, I don't know that they get a huge benefit from the caterpillars, but they're not necessarily harmed from the caterpillars. So if you notice, even some of the most, defoliated trees, cherry trees, are already starting to leaf out for a second time. So the trees leaf out a second time, and they are still able to photosynthesize. Most of them will still flower and fruit. So if we have more than a 3-year boom cycle, then there might be some issues and some trees might have a problem. But I think in general, last year was a big year as well, although this year kind of tops that one.
So the takeaway for people who think these are hideously unattractive and are doing permanent damage to the environment is don't worry.
So there's 3 basic things that are, I guess, our take-homes of the caterpillar story. One is that the trees will be fine. If a tree or a shrub dies because of the caterpillars, there's probably something already wrong with it that it couldn't leaf out again. The second thing is that these are native species, and so we don't like to encourage, reducing or getting rid of native species. If it's a boom for the caterpillars, it's a boom for the other species as well. So the birds, there are over 60 species of birds that eat tent caterpillars, including the chickadees. Cuckoos are the ones that are known a lot, but we don't have that many cuckoos here. But chickadees, blue jays, robins, tons of things eat the caterpillars. So it's, if you love birds, you love the caterpillars. And then, I really worry about people generally spraying for the caterpillars because they tend to impact not just the caterpillars. So pollinators, nectar-feeding species like butterflies, things that everybody loves. And then even if you don't like butterflies or bumblebees, I don't know what kind of heartless person you are, but you're also then affecting the birds that will eat those species. So, and being a native species, these caterpillars have their own checks and balances. There are parasites that will eat the caterpillars and things like that. So I think just let nature take its course. This time of year, now that the caterpillars have kind of gone and are going into their cocoons, feel free to remove the tents, those unsightly poop-filled, little tents. So those can be removed, just brush them down or something like that. But just don't spray the caterpillars, I guess, is my final take-home for those caterpillars.
Great. Well, thank you for educating us on the subject because it's, there are people who are very inclined to go out and do whatever they can to get rid of them.
Yeah.
And so thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Sarah Bois, the Director of Research and Education at the Linda Loring Nature Foundation. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan.